Thank you for listening to Horsepower Heritage. Rate and review the podcast, tell your friends about the show, subscribe to the YouTube channel for more classic car content, and support the show with a donation at buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. You'll find helpful links in the show notes. Hi, everybody. This is Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for joining me once again, and this time we're talking about the so-called golden age of sports car racing in the 1950s and 60s, when there was a ton of crossover between production cars and pure competition cars, and many new manufacturers like Abarth, Allard, Bristol, Ferrari, Lotus, Oscar, Porsche, and the list goes on. Club racing made motorsport more accessible than ever before, and corporate sponsorship and influence was still minimal. Really, the average guy could still buy a sports car off the showroom floor and go racing that weekend. And my guest today is part of a new generation of enthusiasts who are helping to keep the golden era alive on the street and the circuit. Max Minshull is just 27 years old, but he's immersed in vintage racing and historical research, especially when it comes to the excitement of the Southern California sports car craze of the 50s and 60s. He races his own Porsche 356A coupe, and he's resurrecting a long-dormant Southern California sports car club, as you'll hear. We recorded this episode in August in Carmel, California, during Monterey Car Week, and what a perfect place to do it. And I thoroughly enjoyed talking to Max. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Max Minshull. Enjoy. So what got you into old cars? Because how old are you?
27.
27, okay. A young guy to be interested in a lot of the historic stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I guess my background in old cars goes back to my dad's side of the family. My grandfather worked for Ford, was a chemical engineer, and bought my grandmother a fresh off the line K-Code 64.5 Cabriolet Mustang that unfortunately has been lost to time, and I've been unsuccessful in trying to track it down. But he was a Ford guy. My dad had a Jag in his early days, XJS. He drove around in Dallas with a mustache and a cowboy hat. And then in 1987, he bought a 560 SL new, which I have fond memories of as a young kid. And then, from there, he had a bit of success in business and bought a 67 E-Type in 2013 when I was 14 or 15 years old. And bought that. And then we also got a Pagoda SL around that time. And my mom taught me stick in that, and then kind of got into the classic car thing through my dad to some extent. But I've kind of taken it to a whole nother level, I would say.
I think so, yeah. Some kids don't get the car gene passed down.
Sure. Yeah, and I wouldn't say he's a car guy, but I think that he's in the collectibles business and numismatics, which is gold coins, and so he has an appreciation for history. And I think cars kind of grew out of that. But as a young person, he was obsessive about it. I think that I kind of got that part of the genes for cars. So in the same way that he had for coins at the same age. But we've really bonded over it, and I think that's a big part of it. But I have a background in historical research. That was my favorite subject all through school, and then I went to university for that. So it kind of, I think, really dovetailed nicely, where it's about the driving and the social aspect, but also the kind of focus on historical accuracy and trying to understand the context that the cars were in. It's something I really enjoyed, both road cars racing and trying to give back through helping people with photographic research, helping people with authenticity. I've actually turned on a few friends of mine who were here this weekend racing at the Historics to a sign painter named Valentina Trenti, who, a lot of cars here just generally have decals, nothing too specific, but a lot of cars in period had sign painting, and I've kind of turned her on to work on a lot of these cars. And it may be a small thing, but I think it's important to really complete a lot of these cars, is to have them be in their authentic period specification and look. And it's an enjoyable part of the hobby.
There's nothing like a hand-painted livery on a racing car. Yeah, it looks fantastic. And the vinyl decals just don't get there.
Yeah, well, they can, and they were more common, as time went on and sponsorship became a bigger deal. But there's something so, quaint about a lot of the 50s and early 60s cars that had hand painting liveries and numbers. And I've kind of, I don't know, it's just been kind of a little niche thing that I've obsessed over is trying to spread the gospel of sign painting and hand painted liveries, which I think is actually catching on, not just from me, but in general, people I think are really turning on to it. So it's fun to see that.
Yeah, especially the La Carrera Panamericana cars.
Yeah.
They were all really nicely decorated and hand lettered.
Yeah. I think that's kind of like the, pre-war cars mostly were just painted in their country's livery, right? You don't see that much sign painting. I'm sure somebody will think of a few cars that I haven't thought of, but I think the La Carrera cars are kind of like the high point of artistry on cars. You have the BMW art car thing, which comes in later with more popular artists, Calder and Warhol. But I think the La Carrera cars are really unique with just how extensive the liveries were on them. I had the pleasure of seeing one of the Ferraris in the UK when I was there recently, and I've not been around that many of the original La Carrera cars, but a couple of the Porsches, I mean, they're iconic liveries. Porsche did a GT4 RS in the livery of one of the early 550 Spiders that ran at La Carrera in, I think, 1954. And then the other thing with the sign painting, too, from an artistic standpoint, is you had these unique sign painters who would work on certain events. And I can't recall off the top of my head maybe their names, but you had like a guy who did all the numbers for the Mille Miglia. And when you look at a Mille Miglia period photo, you can see it's like the same guy who did the same number in the same way. Same thing with the Targa Florio, and that event went on for much longer into the 60s. And it was kind of like you had the one guy who did the Targa or the Mille, and it's very like period and geographically unique. And then you see that a little bit with like the SCCA cars, but certainly with the Italians, I mean, I think the flair is certainly there when you look at the photos from that era.
And with the Mille Miglia and Targa Florio cars, those guys had to work in a hurry.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's
a big field.
Yeah. They're moving through pretty quickly, and there's actually not much bleeding on the paint, so they did a good job. They would dry it quickly, or
they had the
way
mix
to do it.
They had the mix just right to come off the brush but not run.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you're right, there is a very distinctive hand. I'm just thinking about photographs that I've seen and some of the cars that I've seen at shows that were Targa Florio or Mille Miglia alumni.
Yeah.
And there's a very distinctive hand there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Which is so important to reproduce properly if you're restoring something.
Yeah, it's important. I think for race cars, it's always tricky with race cars, right? Because a lot of them did multiple events, and certainly multiple events that are of historic importance. So it's always kind of a challenge to choose which period in time you represent a car. And certainly I think part of it is getting all the little details right, and that really adds to the ambiance,
Yeah, and some people tend to pick the high point of that car's career, while others go for the, maybe the first iteration.
Yeah. And there's some kind of mix and matching, I think, that happens that people can get away with picking and choosing certain parts. I mean, maybe not for like a Pebble Beach show car, but certainly a lot of the cars that are, active historic racers, I think it's cool when people are like, oh, well, actually this stripe was a little bit better, and I'm going to incorporate that with this number or that number. And for example, like on my A coupe, he ran my 356 A coupe, the original owner ran 4 or 5 different numbers. So I wasn't like married to a number per se, but I did the exact same style of number that he ran with kind of the block, the block lettering. I kind of did little pieces to add up the overall look to the car. Also it's kind of a fun mental challenge to like when you certain particularly historic cars, you think like, oh, the other liveries they ran, and you look at it and you're like, oh, it actually ran this other livery, and you have to sort of keep in your mind which livery is running or not. Sometimes that can be confusing when you're tracking these individual chassis if you really get into the nitty gritty of it, which a lot of us as enthusiasts probably spend too much time doing.
Yeah. So what is your focus period-wise? What are the cars that fascinate you the most, and the period that fascinates you the most? I
would say that I'm a California native, 5th generation, and there was something so special about that sort of late 50s, early 60s golden age of California road racing that I have a particular interest in that from a historical perspective, partly because so many of those tracks are gone and that memory is sort of fading. You think about places like Paramount Ranch,
Santa Barbara.
Yeah, Santa Barbara. Del Mar, all these places are sort of it's almost an extinction threat to the history that was made there. And we're very lucky to have a lot of places like Goodwood where they've been revived literally back to how they were, or you have iconic tracks that have evolved over time, Laguna being a good example. But for Southern California, I would say, we have so little left because there was so much urban development that kind of washed away the kind of quaint history that Southern California in particular had. And it remains such a hub of car culture that I think that's worth kind of focusing on and preserving. And so that era in particular, I'm very fond of. But that extends to just, general road racing in the 50s and 60s. But I think as I've gotten more into the hobby, I've tried to experience more and more of the different flavors of motorsport. So some people, they kind of really hone in on road racing, but I think, if you don't understand sprint cars, let's say, as an American motorsports enthusiast, you don't really understand American racing, right? And how much of a role that played in professional racing in that time. I mean, sports car racing was pretty amateur in the United States in those days, and it was difficult to break into the pro teams. On the West Coast, people like Richie Ginther and Dan Gurney were able to, but most of the iconic American drivers of the period were really actually in sprint cars, people like Parnelli Jones, who was in California. So it's not even just in the Midwest where
Dave McDonald.
McDonald, exactly. So it wasn't, the same ladder we think of today. So yeah. And I think that there's been a lot of siloing in racing to some extent. And I've been lucky enough to try and get involved in different things, Baja racing being another, right? Part of the reason why I'm such a fan of Parnelli Jones is because he did all these different disciplines and did them so well. So I think that element of racing, I also really enjoy is the kind of multifaceted skills that these drivers had beyond just road racing, which is sort of, the bread and butter of what I'm focused on. But learning about these other disciplines has been really, really fascinating as well. So I think, generally 50s and 60s racing is my forte.
And the variety of cars at the time is unparalleled.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. The whole range of specials and, how many European cars came over secondhand, of course, most of the time. The Ferraris being a good example. And then also how many were sold new here. And we essentially kept the European sports car market afloat, especially the English sports car market.
No doubt.
Just in California. So
yeah, the variety, and I think arguably the worldwide motor industry was more or less at its peak in about 1960 in terms of the number of sports cars and manufacturers. And like you say, the cottage manufacturers too, companies like Oscar, Abarth.
Yeah. So
yeah, such a variety. Are there some favorites car-wise for you in the era?
Yeah, it's funny. Being 6'6", I kind of get sized out of a lot of cars.
Sure.
So, I'm a huge fan I love Oscar, right? With, the twin cam being, somewhat unique, being the Porsche rival, right? Which is now long forgotten. But a lot of cars I've gravitated towards are maybe ones I could have a better chance of fitting in. And Porsche kind of leads the charge in that. They're slightly roomier than the English and Italian rivals of their day. So yeah, I think an A coupe, is right up there. A friend of mine told me recently it's one of those cars that you could put a 300 SL in this category as well, maybe, where it's like if they made 100 of them like they did with the Italian cars, they'd be worth 10x or 20x what they're worth, but they were such a great car that they sold really well, even though they weren't cheap back in the day. So, that's just a great car. And I've been really lucky to race one a couple times that I was able to buy a few years ago and do some road rallies. And they're just all around a great car. But that's for 50s cars, I think, my favorite. And then in the 60s, I really, I love short wheelbase 911s, but I think I've grown more and more fond of Lotus because of just how advanced they were for the time and also how accessible they were to an extent, because Porsches were still always kind of a reach car for a lot of people. And not as if Lotus were cheap, they were actually quite expensive because they were so advanced. I mean, an Elan was almost the same price as an E-Type, right? But you look at the performance they offered, and it's really unbelievable how innovative Chapman and the whole team were at the time. So
he was bonding the chassis to the body.
Yeah,
it's kind of a unibody in a way.
Well, the first Lotus road car was the Lotus Elite, and that was a fiberglass monocoque,
right?
With the only metal being the suspension components,
right.
And they were extremely expensive to make and very labor intensive, and they lost money on every single one they made. And this was right when Chapman had developed, earlier on, he had the 16 Formula One car, and then the 18 Formula One car, which was his big break into Grand Prix success with the Rob Walker car, Sterling Moss driving, winning at Monaco in 60 and 61, as well as the German Grand Prix in 61. So they were kind of becoming a more global brand, but they weren't making any money on road cars. And, they weren't able to charge the premiums that, let's say, Enzo Ferrari could on his road cars to roll back into the racing budget. So in 62, I'm forgetting the name, and somebody will certainly know it, but I think the person who invented the movable workbench or something in the United Kingdom, he had built this a backbone frame. And then they were able to put on a simplified fiberglass body onto that, and that's what the Elan was. And then also critical to that was the twin cam motor, which was a lot cheaper to produce based on the Ford, Cortina block essentially versus the Climax motor, which was a fire hydrant motor.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is also more expensive and complicated to run. And the Elan was a huge success, very fast and capable for its time. So. But also fiberglass, right, which was kind of like the carbon fiber of the day, and a little bit easier to work with and cheaper than aluminum, which was the more similarly exotic, but required more of a artisanship, coach building background, which is why the Italians and some of the Germans really relied on that for their racing program and racing cars. But you didn't see a lot of aluminum road cars. It was difficult to produce in mass, essentially.
Easier to lay up fiberglass on a mold than it is to beat panels.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, Colin Chapman was obsessed with weight, reduction of weight. Yeah.
Often to his detriment, right? I mean, the complaint was that they lasted just long enough to cross the finish line.
Yeah.
But, I think all cars were dangerous at the time, so it's a little hard to single them out necessarily. Certainly race cars, I should say.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Just the history of, well, let's take fuel tanks, for example.
Yeah.
You had a very slow adaptation of fuel bladders and foam in the tank to suppress vapors and splash and all that in the event of a collision and a rupture. And it took 15, 20 years for that to sort of be adopted across global motorsport.
Well, and safety obviously became a greater and greater priority through the 60s, which was certainly a good thing, just based on how many people, unfortunately, were killed in avoidable accidents, right? I mean, Clark being the biggest crossroads in terms of the way that people thought about safety, with Jackie Stewart really citing that as his motivation to push Formula One to really think about safety in the way that cars were run.
And the big accident at Indy in 1965, I think.
Well, McDonald was killed in 64 at Indy.
That's it. Yeah.
But I just think IndyCar, I don't know if IndyCar got that much safer for a long time in some ways, with ethanol methanol, with all the fuel that they were running, and just the way that the speeds those cars were going, right? It's difficult to make them safe. So, yeah, I mean, even still to this day, IndyCar is certainly more dangerous than almost any other motorsport, right?
Yeah, because the speeds are sustained.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're not, it's different than circuit racing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think sprint cars probably were right up there with the danger too.
Yeah. Sports
car racing was dangerous, but I think you really, Grand Prix cars, just because they were so light and you're carrying such speeds, were up there. And then proper road racing went away, because of how dangerous it was. But sprint car racing, that was the way that a lot of people in the U.S. made a livelihood. And it's every Friday night, and it's, you're wheel to wheel. You can't rest. You can't take a break. There's no pit stops necessarily, right? So, that was pretty dangerous, and still does remain kind of dangerous, which maybe is part of its appeal and how pure and raucous it is as a form of motorsport, where most GT cars now, it's like that people very rarely get hurt, thankfully, but it's changed the dynamic of the danger, which Moss cited as one of the appeals of why he raced was the danger. It was almost like bullfighting or mountain climbing in that way. It was less neutered than it has become over time.
Right.
So.
Sprint cars have always been the feeder too for NASCAR and even IndyCar.
Yeah.
That's where you learn.
Yeah. The link's been kind of cut, but I was very happy to see. I was at the 500 this year, my first 500, and Kyle Larson, who races NASCAR, is doing the double, which is essentially the 500, and then you fly out to Charlotte for the NASCAR race in the same day. And I think he's one of the very, very few drivers who's raced in the 500 that has a sprint car background in the past few decades. So it's still kind of hanging on. But in those days, it was only sprint car drivers that made it. So
how about you? You said you're vintage racing. How did that come about? Tell me about getting your license and getting your feet wet.
Yeah, so I kind of going back to the story of my family's background in classic cars, was fortunate to be around it in high school and, doing a few rallies and kind of being part of the collector side of it. And then I went to school up in the Bay Area. I was at Stanford for 4 years and studied history while I was there. Worked on the Kissinger biography, the authorized one, which is coming out soon, part 2, which was a lengthy project. And while I was there working on that project for a professor named Neil Ferguson, who's at the Hoover Institution, he's really big on something called applied history, which is this idea that a lot of people think of history as just sort of this ethereal thing that, maybe nerds care about, and that's about it. Just for context, I was one of 4 history majors in my entire class of 2000. So it is quite a niche thing, unfortunately, in the modern American university. But my professor's counterpoint was that history is actually more important than ever because although it doesn't exactly guide you to what decisions to make, it's really the best anecdote we have for human behavior in the past, right? So transitioning into cars from that kind of standpoint, there's no more applied history in cars than racing historic cars, right?
Sure.
And I think that I was kind of drawn into that because of just how you really live what they were doing, in a sense that you certainly can through collecting and owning and driving classic cars, but racing kind of takes it to like the ultimate level, in a sense, is how I see it. So in 2020, was able to get my license right before COVID in spec Miatas, and then soon after that, sort of looked at the finances of how expensive it is to run anything in a modern contemporary sense in racing for road car racing, and was like, wow, I can do these really awesome events like the Monterey Historics or Velocity or Goodwood, and the budgets are actually considerably less to race a vintage car. You have a higher entry point maybe with buying a car, but you actually, I think, get a lot of good value in vintage racing. And it was kind of the obvious choice for a hobbyist. And I think that I've really tried to promote that as a younger driver in historic cars, which you don't see a lot of, especially in the United States. You don't see a lot of. More so in Europe, you see younger people getting into it as a serious kind of hobby if they have the ability to, of course, or the opportunity.
And it doesn't have to be the high-end stuff.
No, of course
it could
not,
be a Mini Cooper or a Ford Anglia.
Yeah, any of these things.
Or a Jaguar Mark II. Yeah,
I mean, I a friend of mine who runs a Porsche shop, we were like, just almost thinking about buying this Cortina GT, so not even a twin cam, so with a pushrod motor. And, I think the car sold for, I don't know, $15,000 or $20,000, which, is not a lot of money for a car these days. And you could go and race the thing, and if you keep the revs under control, you can have a really good time. I don't run my own cars. I don't feel confident enough as a mechanic to do that, and I really appreciate the skill the mechanics bring. But you can really do it for a lot cheaper than people think. You don't have to have the really expensive rig and the 18-wheeler with the camper and the whole thing, which has become a lot more common in racing, and it's certainly not cheap, obviously. But you look at the period photos, going back to the photo element, you look at the period photos, like they really were just on the dirt in the paddock, even if they were pros.
Definitely.
And that's a way that they kind of kept costs under control when there wasn't major sponsorship.
The mechanics would sleep under the transporters.
Yeah.
They didn't even have a hotel room many times. And I'm talking about like factory mechanics.
Oh yeah,
Maserati and Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, the best of the best. So yeah, and you still have that kind of spirit in vintage racing to some extent. You can kind of you don't have to do it necessarily at the high end. I just think there's just such good value in it, and that's something that appealed to me. Besides the natural affinity I have for older cars, and the fact that you have to treat them with a lot more mechanical sympathy, right? And there's that element to the endurance of a car and knowing where to push and when not to push, and how to like feel, if a car has an issue or not. And I think in modern cars, just because there's so many more interfaces between you and the actual physical object of the motor or the gearbox or the chassis itself, you kind of lose a little bit of that interplay, right? And I think that's a whole nother skill set to develop. Whereas in modern cars, it's almost like one line, maximum grip, 11/10 the whole time, and a big budget to go along with that. Whereas in vintage cars, you can kind of
it's direct.
Yeah.
When you push the pedal, there's either a mechanical linkage or a hydraulic line.
Yeah.
And it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
So
and it's on you to treat it with respect too, right? Because obviously there's more danger to some extent with an older car in the case of an accident. But I think that kind of adds to the thrill a little bit. I'm not above admitting that. A lot of my friends who have raced in modern cars, they think I'm in a death trap, and certainly I don't for one second say it's safe, but I think that there's a certain appeal to kind of the thrill of that. As long as you're not taking egregious risks, there's something that I think is people kind of underappreciate the kind of challenge of that, right? And thankfully track design's gotten a lot better, right? So even though the cars have gotten safer with full roll cages, where back in the day, you look at people like Dan Gurney, they're below the roll bar the whole time. That's gotten safer, but also track design to a large extent has gotten safer. Maybe almost too safe, right? Laguna Seca being an example where they've added runoff, places like turn 6 up the hill, where if you put a wheel off, you were at a lot more risk, and you had to really be really precise with your exit. And now you can kind of run off wide a little bit more, which I think I'm not the biggest fan of. But you do still have places like Goodwood being the ultimate example of somewhere where there's really no margin for error. And that's why I think the best racing comes to that, because you look at it and you're like, wow, they really are like on the limit of the track to get a good lap. And that's something that I don't think anybody can downplay. And it's why it's the most popular form of vintage motorsport is, I watch Goodwood on YouTube. And I think that there's it's hard to overestimate how much that's done for people to view historic motorsport as like a very positive and serious form of racing that isn't just kind of parade laps or just kind of displaying a car at 5/10 around the track or something like that. So
plus being on skinny tires and drifting through corners, it's really dynamic as a spectator to watch that.
I highly recommend anybody go. I mean, it's one of those things where my father always told me that, better to have no expectations, right? And then you can just be genuinely pleased when something is enjoyable. Because expectations, it's kind of like the enemy of happiness. But I had sky high expectations going into the revival. I hadn't gone as a spectator, but I was driving, and it was still vastly exceeded. And I went last year when it was a torrential downpour the whole time.
What were you in?
I was in my A coupe, which was a whole other story of trying to get that into the event as an American, where there's very few Americans who actually get to drive over there. So I feel very fortunate, and I feel an obligation to try and promote Americans going over there to drive if they have the ability and the will to do so, because I think it's such a special event that kind of changes you when you go, and you can bring that back to whatever club level local racing you get to do, like I get to do in California, for example, where I live.
Hi guys, Maurice Merrick here, and I want to tell you about this amazing event, the Slow Baja Vintage Expedition, October 11th through the 18th, Ensenada to Ensenada. My pal Michael Emery of the Slow Baja podcast, he's been on the show before. Michael does such a great job at Slow Baja. I was on the trip last fall, and it was epic. That word is used a lot now, but I guarantee it fits here. It's non-competitive, leisurely travel through an unforgettable landscape, and you'll be in the company of some of the best people you'll ever meet. If you've got an old Bronco or a Myers-Manx or Toyota FJ, if it's got four-wheel drive and it's 30 years old or looks 30 years old or it's just flat out cool, you should be doing the Slow Baja Vintage Expedition. I know some of you guys have an old 4x4 sitting next to that 911 in your garage. You've got to join us. And this year is a special tribute. It's the 50th anniversary celebration of Sal Fish's first Baja 1000. Sal is a Baja legend. We're going to drive the best legs of his original route. Sal is going to be on the trip pouring Fortaleza tequila for everyone. We've got Kurt LeDuc, Off-Road Motorsports Hall of Famer, trophy truck driver, and Kurt's coming along as the mechanic. So that opens up the trip to you Jeep guys, you Scout guys, even us Land Rover guys. Michael and his team take care of all the details. It's all-inclusive, 3 meals a day. In fact, I guarantee you'll eat better in Baja than you would at home. Primo camping along the way, and a hotel for the last night where you wash away that trail dust, but the memories are going to stay with you forever. So don't miss it. October 11th through the 18th, Ensenada to Ensenada. Go to slowbaja.com/adventures. There's a link in the show notes, but space is limited. So go to slowbaja.com/adventures today and join us on the Slow Baja Vintage Expedition. Now, going forward, you're looking for a ride, right?
Always, yeah. It's always kind of the chase, right? And I'm fortunate to have been offered a few seats, let's just say. It's tricky because in the U.S., there's a lot more coaching opportunities, let's just say, for younger drivers like myself to coach, let's say, modern racing, right? But in Europe, you kind of have this own little market of people that can coach historic cars and be fast in historic cars. And I'm fortunate to be friends with Horatio Fitzsimon, who's very well known from his YouTube videos of racing historic cars, and he's been able to, be fortunate enough to be given some rides as well. And it's tricky to do that.
I know Horatio.
You got to be fast, right? And I think I'm a little bit off the pace from that, certainly.
And he is a fierce competitor.
100%, yeah. So it's cool to see that and see somebody that's my age and really going for it. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I think a lot of it is like I would take more seats, but then it's like, I'd have to modify the car. I typically have to modify a car pretty extensively to fit comfortably. So it's a little bit of that too, where I'm like, all right, well, I'll just focus on my own cars. But yeah, something like a Cortina would be great to share a drive in. So if anybody has one for an arrive and drive, let me know. But
I've got a lot of UK listeners, incidentally. So some of them out there will have a line for you. So
yeah, that'd be great. I appreciate that.
The other aspect of this from a historical point of view, you talked about the cars and the era, and you mentioned a couple of drivers, Sterling Moss, of course, Jim Clark, Dan Gurney. Is that another aspect of this that fascinates you, the men in the machines?
Yeah, I think there's a line from a song that I like that is sort of questioning why are all of my heroes in black and white, right? And I think that it's maybe a little bit too cynical towards the modern racing driver, but there is an element of polish and marketability that you have to have now, that I think the further back in time you go, the less that was the case, and then you look at the pre-war car drivers, the pre-World War II drivers, and they're even larger than life characters than much more larger than life characters than the 60s drivers were.
Tazio Nuvolari.
Yeah. The Bentley boys, Dreyfus, right? I mean,
Rene Dreyfus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I want to explore that more. I really need to read more about pre-war racing.
You know what Rene Dreyfus did after the war? He actually escaped to the United States at a certain point. He opened a restaurant, Le Chantecler, and it was a gathering place for racing drivers after the war. That was like their haunt when they were in New York.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Yeah. And so many of them too, as was the case with a lot of the drivers in the 60s, but they were pilots, they were adventurers. Kidston comes to mind, Simon Kidston's uncle, I believe.
Glenn Kidston.
Yeah, Glenn, who was, I think, killed in an airplane crash in South Africa. But, they weren't just pushing the limits on tracks, right, or roads, frankly, in those days. They were really trying to live life to the fullest in every extent of the word.
Yeah, they were sportsmen.
Yeah, real sportsmen, which I think nowadays things naturally become hyper-focused, and hyper kind of siloed from each other. I think part of it, too, is just that they weren't above anything. Their love was of racing first, and making a living was often secondary, right? Oftentimes just like the manufacturers themselves that prioritized racing over sound business principles. And, a lot of them paid for that sort of passion with their life. But I think that you have to give them a lot of credit for that because they were really a fraternity in a sense. I was reading a story the other day, doing some reading on early 60s Lotus Formula One racing. And there was an instance where Jack Brabham, I think in 63, if I'm not mistaken, had brought his first Formula One chassis to Monaco, and he blew an engine in practice, and he flew back to the UK in his own plane to get the motor rebuilt in the UK, and then flew back down to Monaco, but had some other issue come up, and he gave his car to Dan Gurney, who was the second driver at the time, to use. And Colin Chapman had a spare chassis around that it was a functioning car as a practice car essentially, and he gave it to Jack to drive as kind of a deference to him. I mean, it's just something like that. You would be kind of hard pressed to think of any corollary to that today in racing. And I think that it just spoke to the fact that they were all really on the same page about the risks they were taking and also what it meant to be a sportsman, right? And I think that kind of thing is cool to read about, and hopefully people try and be inspired by that today. I think in vintage racing, you see that a lot where people are sharing parts and they're helping each other out, and maybe they're not getting cars given to them. Actually, that does actually happen sometimes. I've heard of that happening where, somebody will have a breakdown and somebody has a third or fourth car type thing. They'll give them the ride for the rest of the weekend. And yeah, I kind of like that element of it because it still is, it's period correct, right?
The fraternity
of
the 60s.
Yeah, the fraternity element.
Yeah.
And people came from all types of backgrounds, right? You had the wealthy sportsmen, but you also had, in those days, a lot of mechanics turned drivers, people like Ginther and Hill and Gurney, starting off as
Ken
mechanics.
Miles.
Yeah, Ken Miles as well. So I think you had kind of a broader mix to some extent because it was a little more accessible to get rides if you could find a sponsor. And it still is the case today, but it's a little bit more bifurcated where you have just like the very wealthy gentleman drivers, and then you have these kind of very single-minded kids who either through luck or some sponsorship or a combination of both just rose up through the karting ranks, right? And were really fast. Whereas in those days, you could kind of be a mechanic driver a little bit more so than certainly you can today. And that gave them, I think, greater depth, and certainly as somebody who's not a mechanic to that much of an extent, I really appreciate that element and think it's impressive to say the least, to be that good mechanically and also be that quick of a driver. Ginther being a good example. He actually was one of the early guys to bring in aerodynamics or downforce, I should say, because he worked as a helicopter mechanic in Korea when he was drafted. So he knew kind of more about aerodynamics just from an aerospace kind of background, and, didn't necessarily revolutionize it in the same way that, Jim Hall did or something, but was bringing that to the table kind of in the early days just because of his background, right? Whereas if he was a pure driver, he wouldn't necessarily have thought of that. So it's a cool thing to read about the little intricacies of each of the drivers' backgrounds and how their lives played out. So
if I'm remembering right, Jim Clark had no interest in motor racing and went to the track with a friend, I think, who wanted to be a driver and was trying to break in.
Yeah.
And then Jim ended up driving and becoming one of the greatest in history.
Yeah.
A Scottish farmer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Goes to show how much, God-given talent he had. I believe it was Ian Scott Watson who was his friend. And he gave him a DKW, which was this kind of off-brand sedan.
Right. This wheezy little thing.
Yeah, exactly. Not exactly, a go-kart or, even a sprint car, which is how a lot of the others started or have started today and started in the past, or a sports car, right? A lot of people started in speedsters and MGs, in those days. But, and progressed quite quickly, but was always kind of a shy figure, right? And, it's the Clark thing is cool. He also drove an A, for a couple of years, a 356A, which a friend of mine owns in the United Kingdom, and I raced against it at Revival, so that was a real thrill. And he daily drove that car as well, so that's kind of a fun tidbit. He would commute back and forth to the races from Scotland all the way down to southern England or on the continent in his A coupe, and then he loved the car so much that he was a little bit hesitant to let go of it when Chapman in 1960 who signed him to the Formula One team said, "Hey, you gotta drive an Elite. You can't drive a Porsche anymore." Right. And he had an automatic Elite. I think one of very few made as sort of a prototype. And he hesitantly gave up his A coupe. So it goes to show how much he loved it. Yeah.
There's some great pictures of Jim Clark leaning up against that Lotus.
Yeah. Well, the one he's most photographed is in his kilt with the Elan, right?
Oh, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Which is I drive my Elan for pleasure, not because I have to.
Right.
And he put a lot of miles on his Elan. He had a few of them over the years, and they're all great cars. Clark's most famous road car would be his Elan, which was the prototype Elan that Dario Franchitti later acquired and is subsequently sold. But it's a lovely piece of history, and a lot of these cars, I know, for example, the A coupe that Jim drove was almost destroyed in a scrapyard. So, I think that we've been very lucky to try and save at least a few of these treasures that aren't just the cars that won the Grand Prix, but the way that he got there,
By the way, you're kind of on the hunt for historic racing cars in Southern California, right? That raced in period. Have you found any that have sort of were forgotten about, or?
I don't have a really good barn find story yet. I'm still hunting. I'm thankfully friends with a lot of people that have had barn finds, and my friend Blue Nelson has been famous over the years for Southern California barn finds, and he's been doing it since the late 80s. And I think there's still a few out there. I kind of focus on Porsche, and I think there's a lot of interesting early 911s that in particular I've tried to hone in on and finding, and it's a fun chase for sure. And then also there's kind of cars that hide in plain sight, that oftentimes their history can be overshadowed by just any number of reasons, right? And I think that especially that happens with Porsche 356s are a good example, where so many as a percentage, a lot of 356s raced in period, especially A speedsters and coupes. And the attrition rate of both the cars just rusting out or being destroyed is almost not as great as the history being just written over, right? Or the paperwork being, lost or thrown out. Oftentimes because it's a little bit easier to sell, lightly driven, cars than I race this thing every weekend. So I think that kind of part of it is special when you can find one. And a good friend of mine who's here this weekend, debuting a speedster it's called the Monterey Speedster is the nickname for it. It was just a kind of average road car restoration. And, I don't think without his vision, it would be back on the track again, even though it's one of the iconic California Speedster War cars that I think deserves to be out on track, but often I think people are maybe a little bit apprehensive about going racing because it's expensive and, it's, all the dangers and everything. And they just would rather have it as a road car, but a car like that really should be a race car. There's plenty of generic examples you can go and pick. So anybody who has a car with any racing history, please try and at least, highlight that or have it be a part of that car's life to even just do, track driving and maybe more of a relaxed setting, because there's such a character to cars that raced and that are known to have raced, right? Which a lot of cars lose their history, is a way of putting it, even if the car exists, so.
Bruce Meyer was telling me about when Steve McQueen came by to look at his 356.
Yeah.
Because Steve thought that was his car that he had raced in the early 60s, and he said McQueen peeled back the carpet and found the bolt holes for where the roll bar was.
Yeah.
And
yeah, exactly. That whole, and even McQueen, when he bought that, must have been in the early 70s, back from Bruce. There was that kind of nostalgia then for a car that he had driven. But I think the thrill of the discovery of trying to piece together a car's racing history is often just as thrilling for somebody like myself who didn't race the car or wasn't even around in period or didn't see it drive in period as it is for somebody who's buying back their old car.
Isn't that weird how we have a nostalgia for a period we never actually knew?
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I have that, and when I'm around these cars, particularly when I talk to people who are around in the era, it's very energizing. Mm-hmm. It's very exciting to me to maybe just grasp just a little piece of that time.
Yeah. And it's, you can sort of access that at all levels of the hobby, right? I mean, even just finding, for me, just the thrill of finding a period photo of a car, right, is exciting more than maybe what color or spec or maybe even sometimes how nice the restoration is, right? Which is obviously important. But I think, just the sort of the archaeology of it, right? Which is something that Miles Collier talks a lot about is the archaeology of the automobile, right? And that's something that really imbues them with a spirit that differentiates them from just a tool.
Yeah, and when you see those photos, there's a lot of details you can pick out, not just how the car is set up, maybe the tires that they were running, or you can maybe see some equipment on the car that they had added, but also like who's in the background, what transporter they were using, maybe some tools that they had. there's all sorts of little details, even right down to like what the drivers were wearing during a race, which is oftentimes not a fire suit, but maybe like a pair of chinos and a polo shirt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Even just beyond cars themselves, I think there's a really great trend of, this is maybe niche to some extent, but a friend of mine who is debuting his car this weekend at Monterey at the Quail. It's called the Spectre Porsche. His name's Tanner Boys and runs a shop in Utah. He built this amazing car from scratch in the period of a 1950s special out of aluminum. But what's almost as cool as the car itself is the fact that he found a period 1950s single axle trailer in a farmer's field and restored it. And that's how he's arriving with the car, because that's exactly how it would have been if you were going to a race or an event. It's one thing to just roll it off of an 18-wheeler, special enough. But another friend of mine here on the peninsula was famous for taking his 32 horsepower bus around with his friend's unrestored 550A Spider on a single axle trailer. And I mean, just that kind of the whole collection of it, the look, the feel, it's not just maybe the car itself, but like all the little details add up, like you said. So,
and committing to those details.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's something that's so appealing about Revival is they really care about that in a way that no other vintage racing event does, where like there's no cars after 1966 even allowed within the paddock, or even within the track. So like the pace cars are Series 1E types, or early 911s.
The breakdown trucks are Series Land Rovers.
Yeah, and there's a whole fleet of them. I mean, I did a track walk and you think, oh, there's one or two. There's like 10 of those things, Even the transport to get around the track, like to go out to the airfield, for example, it's a collection of Jeeps and Land Rovers. Initially, it was Jeeps. The Jeep Club kind of got together, a bunch of Willys Jeeps. But then I think Lord March was like, hey, we need some Land Rovers here. We're in England.
Good man.
So the Land Rover Club, contributed. And people will just bring their car for the weekend. And, it's so that kind of element to it is I think really special. And any way that kind of spirit can be exported from just Revival itself to, any other event that you happen to be at is always fun to see. And I think adds to the ambiance of any event.
Yeah. Well, guys like you and Tanner, you want to live it as authentically as you can. You want to place yourself in that period as much as you can.
Yeah.
By the way, I know Tanner, and I'm looking forward to having him on the show because I've followed his construction and design of the Spectre car from the start, and it's an amazing machine. And I haven't seen it in person yet, but I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. It's a very special thing, and I'm very grateful to Tanner, who's a sort of more recent friend of mine, for his enthusiasm for this little sports car club that I'm helping put together.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The Pacific Sports Car Club.
Yeah.
Which was, in period, one of the clubs in Southern California.
Yeah. So a good way to think about it is in post-World War II Southern California, you had just this abundance of hot rod clubs, right? Being kind of the main, car club thing. And then adjacent to that, you had all the biking clubs. But there weren't really that many sports car clubs. I mean, you had the club element to Cal Club, which was the local SCCA. It later became SCCA, but at the time was the amateur racing kind of group. But that was more of an organizational structure to some extent. But in terms of like just a clubbiness vibe, Pacific Sports Car Club, which was based in the South Bay, was pretty unique in a lot of ways. Contextually, it makes sense there wasn't a lot of quote-unquote sports car clubs because most people who could afford sports cars were married or working in the defense industry primarily in Southern California. So they didn't have as much free time as the, newly minted GIs who, were hot rodding their 32 Fords or, hot rodding their motorcycles, which were a lower price point entry than a Speedster was or something. But this club was really, really unique in that they had social events every week in Redondo Beach at the American Legion Hall. They would all go race together and they would run decals together. And then they would actually do an annual event in the Mojave lake beds where they would do a 1-to-1 of the Le Mans track. They would just map it out on the lake bed and then they would do some, average speed time trial thing overnight and all camp together. And a lot of this history is out there to some extent if you look at photos and kind of piece it together, but nobody had really done that until I kind of got a hold of this. And it's been really fun to explore this journey of like, tracking which cars did which events, running the decals, and how the club developed from kind of 25 to 30 members in the mid 50s when it got started into its peak in the early to mid 60s, but it kind of faded off after that. But they really were like an active club that was just focused on having fun with your car, racing, autocrossing, the social aspect. It wasn't necessarily like a mark focused club, which I think is more common now, where it's like, oh, I'm in the Porsche club or I'm into this club. And the Pacific Sports Car Club was very just, bring what you want that's a sports car and let's have fun. And I kind of like that element.
So how are you doing this research? Is this library research? Are you going to the LA Times and looking at their morgue? I mean,
it's a combination of things. So I think pictures have been the primary avenue. And then newspapers.com, which is an amazing resource for anybody out there who wants to research race results or anecdotes about race cars from the 50s and 60s and really beyond, has been a great resource because you can type in and the searching function on that is pretty accurate. And you can kind of, California, 1960 to 63 Pacific Sports Car Club, and it'll populate, the ads they would pad out for their meetings or whatnot. It's not foolproof, right? But you kind of combine that with photos. Then I've been very fortunate to meet a couple former members who are still with us. And one of them, a guy named Jerry Barker, whose father Ed was in the club, has a scrapbook. And that was critical to kind of filling in some of the gaps on the club. And the club was the two most well-known members for people in the audience who know 50s and 60s sports car racing were Davey Jordan and a guy named Bob Chalman. So Davey drove for Vashik Polak, had a Speedster and drove Spiders, drove 911s for Vashik, and he was very enthusiastic about the club, and he's still with us, and I would love to be able to chat to him as soon as possible about his memories of the club, although he's quite elderly. And then Bob Chalman, who passed away in the late 90s, was the Lotus dealer after a guy named Jay Chamberlain lost the distributorship from Colin Chapman over some disagreement they had. And Chalman ran his dealership in Manhattan Beach in the South Bay of Los Angeles. And a lot of Alans and Elites went through him, as well as Lotus 23s. And he would always represent the club on his car with the Pacific Sports Car Club logo, which has a seahorse and a checkered flag. And he was quite active in Cal Club. And, obviously Lotus was intimately tied in with race cars, as Porsche was. It really fed back into the brand in that time. So they were kind of leading the charge. But it was really a hodgepodge of people that had, MGAs, auto body shops. I'm thinking of a guy named Gordon Cooper who had a body shop who had a Nardes Alpha, which was a kind of rebodied car with a 6C motor. It was kind of like a Etceterini car, if you want to call it that. So he was in the club. You had people with MGAs, like I mentioned. You had people that were, Alpha guys, Giulietta Spiders, and they all just loved going out on the weekends and having fun. And I think that it's been cool to kind of bring back some of that imagery. And Tanner's done a really amazing job of getting some 50s t-shirts printed up for us for this week with the correct logo. And then we also, in the scrapbook I mentioned, we found an amazing photograph of a flag that they would hang from the trailer off a fence, and he recreated that flag, and his whole family helped paint it. So we're going to hang that from our trailer at the track this weekend as kind of like the debut.
Terrific.
So, yeah.
Are you trying to resurrect the Pacific Sports Car Club and sort of bring people together that have period cars and want to be a part of that club?
Yeah, I think that it's very informal at this moment. It's been kind of a couple years of gathering all the bits and scraps of pieces that have added up to this story. My friend Clay Carr, who is sort of co-president with me, has been a big part of that. We found another thing that's worth mentioning. We in addition to the newspaper research and the photographic and scrapbook research, amazingly, a good friend of ours, Chris Mayring, found a trophy at the Long Beach swap meet of all places that's like in perfect condition, that was issued from the club to the fastest ladies autocross time in 1959. So we've gathered all the physical items that we can, but the club is really sort of an informal group of us that are primarily younger and into 50s and 60s cars, because I think that's kind of a narrow demographic, right? And the club is designed around trying to promote people, let's say, generally under 35 that care about 50s and 60s cars that have a connection to California or live in California because that's where the club is based. But yeah, I think anybody who wants to get involved, I'd love to, try and spread the message of that. And hopefully people are inspired, because I just got lucky that I found something that existed in period, but there's no reason for somebody not to make their own kind of, non-mark specific club for younger guys who are into classic cars. Like, that's what I want to see happen, would be my ideal vision. And I'm very lucky to have stumbled upon PSCC and all the fantastic symbols and imagery and logos and things that we can just kind of plug and play with. But people should be inspired to create their own as well. There's no reason for that not to be a model, versus just a kind of traditional mark-based club. I think it's almost like a younger guy club is maybe our only criteria, because it's just a narrower group of guys that oftentimes are, we're kind of few and far between. A lot of us jokingly, Clay and I's wives say, "Why is it that most of your friends are over 50?" You know what I mean? So, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course. And the older you are, the wiser you are, right? But I think that it's fun to kind of have an outlet for somebody who's maybe in a similar stage of life as you that also shares this passion.
Sure.
Right.
Well, I've got an Alpha Spider. I'm 39, so
I think I'll make the cutoff, right?
I wish I were 39.
Yeah.
But no, it sounds like a lot of fun. And I would love to hang out with you guys if you have an event coming up, or get together with you guys. That'd be really fun. If people want to learn more, do you have a website for that yet?
The best way to kind of learn about the whole PSCC story is through our Instagram page, which I run, and I've been posting club member updates and photos from back in the day. And I also have done 2 newsletters now called The Windscreen, which was what the newsletter in period was called. And I want to do a print run of those. And if you get in touch with me through the app, I can send you the newsletter. So
what's the Instagram handle?
It's Pacific Sports Car Club.
Easy.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Max Minshull. Hey, thanks, man. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time. And get out there and use your cars, and certainly go race them if you can too. That's my message, because we need more people in historic racing, especially in the U.S. It's something that I think you'll never regret.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Rate and review the podcast, tell your friends about the show, subscribe to the YouTube channel for more classic car content, and support the show with a donation at buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.